Good evening, everyone. I've brought Stu with me once again. Say hello.
Hello. Hello.
There we go. We are going to continue with the tutorials and the Q&A. So it's very exciting. And today we're going to talk about something that hasn't been extremely long in game. It actually, you told me just before last week, we've only been in the game for 2 weeks. But there's a lot of useful information about that tutorial in specific, or quest, or thing. So we're going to have a look at it, and we're just going to talk like we did the other 2 live streams. But before we go into it, I'm going to keep your attention for one more second, and we're going to go to the beautiful Twitch Prime banner that we've got in the bottom over there as well, somewhere. You can still get your 14 days of free membership, so make sure to get that. It's quite nice. And also, if you're at it, why not spend your Twitch Prime sub on one of your favorite content creators? So do that. It's pretty cool. Cool. Without further ado, I would kind of like to say the floor is all yours, Stu.
Marvelous. Thank you very much. So, learning the ropes was the next one we're working on. So far in this series, we've walked through the classic tutorial and compared the original and current tutorial island. This week, we're starting an in-depth look at Tutorial 2, the first time we replaced Tutorial Island in 2008. In learning the ropes, you assisted a white knight called Savant in his efforts to defeat a 3-headed dragon in a cellar beneath Lumbridge. Now, if that synopsis sounds familiar, you may have actually played the tutorial called Unstable Foundations. So if we move to the next slide. So we have a comparison between the two. Unstable Foundations was effectively a rework or spiritual successor to Learning the Ropes. Hopefully we'll explore Unstable Foundations in a similar level of detail in a future live stream. Now, fair warning, I have nearly 100 slides in this Learning the Ropes deck, so there's no chance we're going to get through all of this tutorial in the next hour. I'm expecting this tutorial to probably take somewhere between 2 and 4 live streams to complete, especially if we include plenty of Q&A, and I'm determined to make that stick along the way. Also, just a note, I have prepared some notes this time around. I got some feedback that I was getting quite fast in my speech in places, so I'm hoping this will help me slow down a little bit and be a little bit more clear to understand. So, Learning the Ropes was a comprehensive and detailed tutorial, and you know how I like to focus on the small details. So on that note, moving on to the disclaimer, this stream is going to discuss a specific tutorial from RuneScape's past in painstaking detail. We're not showing off a new tutorial or hyping any exciting future content. If you're just here for the RuneScape, that's great, welcome. If the subject of tutorials actually interests you, I can't imagine why it would, but this is how I roll, strap in and hold on to your butts. Now, moving on to the next slide. So, full disclosure, Learn the Ropes was developed by Mod Maz, Queen of the Squirrels. My developer knowledge of Learn the Ropes is quite limited. In 2008, I was in my 2nd year working at Jagex on Mexscape. I remember I was working on the human tutorial at the time, probably reworking it again. I had to do that a lot whenever systems changed. I played an internal build of Learning the Ropes and remember sending over detailed feedback to Maz. I think I also played Learn the Ropes on my live account. Fortunately, Mod Maz was nice enough to tweet me over some thoughts and trivia from her experience with developing Learning the Ropes. I've included more of her commentary from her throughout these slides. As you can see, there's some box arts there with that nice squirrel imagery to help represent her. I'm also going to, on this slide, rely on this glorious extract from Godash in 2009 on the forums to provide you some insights. So first of all, why did we replace the tutorial island in the first place? I mean, how can you improve on perfection? Well, unfortunately, as Ash notes here, and this heat map demonstrates, a significant proportion of new users didn't make it through Tutorial Island. Of those that do complete the tutorial, relatively few have the resilience and determination to keep playing in the long term, unfortunately. So a new tutorial was commissioned that detailed all of the free-to-play skills and all the aspects of the interface at the time. To familiarize new players with the starting zone, Learning the Ropes included a lot of time in a quarantined copy of Lumbridge, rather than a tutorial island that you never return to. Do we have any questions from the chat so far, Luke?
No, we're all good. There was one quick question, and I think it's just a quick start, an icebreaker, so to speak.
Yeah,
what's your
great.
favorite tutorial out of all the different tutorials we've had so far, Stu?
Ah, that's an interesting one. I actually have a really soft spot in my heart for the Lumbridge Tasks. If you're familiar with that one, it's the one that came after Unstable Foundations, where it's effectively a task set. You had this beginner task set in Lumbridge that you went around and you kind of just did in your own time. And there was a little bit of guidance there as well, in that there were some that had you initially like speak to Explorer Jack, pick up some coins on the ground, escort someone towards the catacombs, where it then led you onto Blood Pact. So it starts off a bit linear and then opens up to this achievement set as well, which I rather enjoy as a way that it gives you a lot of freedom to explore and player agency, while also teaching a lot of the mechanics in world rather than in this isolated space you can't return to. So that was kind of my inspiration for moving in more of a path direction in the future.
Mm-hmm. Is that a bit similar to the Lumbridge task to a little bit like Cook's Assistant, where you also kind of give you very easy task, which is quite direct, you can just follow, or is it different from that?
Yeah, it's quite similar in that respect. If you think of like the objectives that you might do during Cook's Assistant, or I mean, a lot of them I think are in the beginner's Lumbridge diary, or certainly the ones that were in the Lumbridge tasks I salvaged and then put into a explorer path. So it's like an objective that you can complete relatively easily, and it just helps you to explore the world and find where things are and engage with the mechanics in a more organic fashion.
Okay. Yeah, no, I get what you mean there. Cool. There were no other questions in the chat.
Okay.
If there are any, please put them in the chat. I'll write them down, and then once we have another natural break, then I'll bring them to you, Stu, in the Q&A, of course. So let's go.
Excellent. Okay, so then moving on to the login screen. Unfortunately, learning the ropes only stayed in the game for a couple of weeks. So there's very little footage available from that narrow window. Pretty much every video I could find on YouTube was low quality footage recorded with our old friend, unregistered Hypercam 2. To put this presentation together, I suffered through a lot of overdubbed Linkin Park. As a fun note, 2008 was also the era when we had this absolutely badass login screen in software mode, as well as the glorious cinematic login screen cutscenes in HD. It was some good times. Moving on. And on this slide, Maz has provided some great trivia about the pre-production of Learning the Ropes. I had actually planned to put this up while we were doing some more questions, but it sounds like we don't have a great deal of other ones. So I'll just see what I can pick out here while you're reading it yourselves. So Lumbridge itself was a copy of Lumbridge that you would then send new players to. So it's a bit like New Varrock in that respect. It's not an instanced environment, but only people who are going through the tutorial at the time could access it, and you couldn't come back to it again afterwards. It also had fences put out around the edges, kind of quarantining the area because of this dragon that was there as a way to confine you in that space. So the idea being that the player is getting to understand the lay of the land of Lumbridge rather than learning about this tutorial island that you never return to. And also had a degree of non-linearity to it too, in that several of the chapters you could complete in any order, which is really cool. Cuts away from the whole notion of being on this railroad where you've got to do things in a certain order. And also, interestingly, there was a chapter that Maz was hoping to add towards the end where Servant actually gets to defeat the dragon, but because she wanted to have some closure for the character, but unfortunately that never got implemented. So moving on. Onto character creation. So it seems like every time we do a new tutorial, it also comes with a character creation screen. And Learning the Ropes, it uses a step-by-step process. It even had you choose 2-button or 1-button mouse as your first action. Moving on. The structures actually quite similar to the user flow of our current character creation, with the addition of a chat head to customize and also a color picker for the different parts of your outfit. Now we get on to the start of the tutorial. Now, as our tutorials became more sophisticated, we had to start considering your narrative context in the world. Having some kind of backstory, we've discovered, is quite controversial. A lot of players roleplay a specific idea of their character's origins, and they don't want a backstory to be dictated to them. So, Learning the Ropes establishes context very briefly. You've got humble beginnings in a cellar. Why? Who knows? You do, and that's all that matters. So it introduces the core mechanics of left-clicking to interact and how to rotate your camera. It's a bit verbose, but fortunately this tutorial does a lot of reiteration to learn these mechanics as you progress. So why are we starting in a controlled, confined area? There's a couple benefits to that. One is managing my old friend, cognitive load. If you have them, feel free to fill in your bingo cards. The other is that being in a narrow space means you're going to have to use your camera controls to interact. And you know how I like learning by doing, so go ahead and tick that one too. So the player talks to Savant and has their first conversation. They get some brief narrative context, white knights, Lumbridge, dragons, establishing the grounded medieval fantasy hallmarks. Now, I'm not sure why there's a three-headed dragon. I'm guessing the intent was to draw parallels to the King Black Dragon. Maz might be in the chat, so maybe she might have a better answer to that one for me. And we kick off some action straight away with a cutscene. Now, we're kind of defining what a cutscene is at the bottom of the screen there, which is maybe a little excessive, especially if that text is drawing your attention away from the cutscene. But I think we're kind of having to work with what we had available at the time. Nowadays, we use letterboxes that slide into position at the top and bottom of your screen to denote a cutscene, and that sells the idea more visually. Now, this cutscene also indicates a prevailing issue of player agency. There's an exciting scene happening here. There's a knight fighting a dragon. It's exactly what you'd expect when you signed up for a fantasy role-playing game. Unfortunately, your role as the protagonist is to watch silently from the wings as an NPC engages in the fun heroism on your behalf.
That is very funky.
Speaking of cutscenes, so I've taken a few slides here from the cutscene that follows this. I'd just like to acknowledge just how well choreographed this cutscene is, especially for the time. There's clearly been some careful composition and a lot of work was spent on bespoke animations, which obviously I'm failing to capture in these static images. I can only assume the sequence was storyboarded. So a goblin drops down into the cellar and starts rifling for something to steal, establishing a new character in the scene. There's a really great flourish of comic timing as the goblin does this like double take and notices there's a stonking great dragon behind him, which then elicits a camera pan back to the action scene. It's a nice smooth flow. Then Savant is battling the dragon, and the dragon elicits this roar that causes a bit of a cave-in. The scene ends with a bit of physical comedy as a series of pebbles plonk down onto the goblin's head, and then a big rock dazes him. I was really impressed rewatching the animation here. Considering the animation tools that we had available at the time, it was really quite an accomplishment. I remember seeing this cutscene at a company update in 2008. It was an early build, so the animation frames were harder to follow. But even back then, I was really impressed with how well this was animated. I reckon there must have been a strong collaboration between the artists and developers here. That's a good place to stop for a Stu&A if we've got any questions.
I've gathered a couple for you. Firstly, I just want to comment you on the unregistered Hypercam 2 error. I think that spoke to a lot of memories for everyone in the chat as well. So I just love that we can even incorporate that in a live stream. There was one person in chat asking, when does the stream end? I'm just here for the loot. If that's the case, and you're still here, you'll probably find you tune out. You have to watch for like up to 5-ish minutes to be picked up, and you'll get your loot after the stream at some point. So thank you for being there. But if we move to the questions more specifically for you, Stu, what's your thought on like an animated or a 3D kind of login screen? Like RuneScape 3's login screen changed a lot. would there be a benefit of having an animated one?
Yeah, I'd say so. I think that is a lot more visually interesting. It allows us to it provides a bit of onboarding for updates too. If we were doing like custom ones that show off this fancy new environments from like Anachrony or something, if it kind of had a steady rotation, I think that would be quite interesting. So yeah, I think it's a good idea. As far as I know, from what I've been given to understand, maintaining the old ones was quite tricky. It was quite a laborious process to create them. So ideally, that if we had more investment in that kind of building that cinematic framework, I think it would be something that we'd be able to make more use of in the future. I think there may have been a bit of an investigation on those lines, but yeah, I can't confirm anything.
Yeah, I don't want to be rude, but how do you feel about the cognitive load on something like that? Is that not a problem in that instance?
That's an interesting point. I think in that scenario, because you're outside of the game at that point, there aren't additional things that might be overwhelming you. Effectively, you just have because when you're first entering, it's kind of the spectacle is good. If you're able to get an impression of what the game is like before you even logged in, there are some barriers you need to overcome in creating your account and the steps that's going to entail. So helping to see that bit of a preview of what the game is actually like beforehand, I think that probably outweighs the cognitive load issues. And again, feel free to scratch that on your bingo card.
We really should start building a bingo card. That would be great. If we can get one for the next one, that would be great. So I'm gonna ask someone to chat to have some fun with that. Another question is: does the three-headed green dragon that we've seen on the images at the beginning and also halfway through, does that dragon have a name by any chance? And do you know that one?
Not that I know of. I've not been able to find it. If you know, Maz, please let us know.
Cool. And then the other one. Do you know why Lumbridge was chosen as a starter location? Or is there a specific reason for that?
Yeah, a very good reason. Well, basically, at the time when you finished Taro Island, the first place you'd land in is Lumbridge. That was the starting zone, and has been for the majority of RuneScape's life. So the critical issue was ensuring that we improve our long-term player retention. It certainly helps if you can retain them during the tutorial, but where you get to real wins is if they continue to play for one day into a week into 30 days to kind of get when they find content that they're engaging with and really enjoying and want to keep playing. And at the time, it was determined that putting the player on this abstract island that they don't come back to, it means you're learning the lay of the land of an environment that's then isn't your starting experience. So Lumbridge was chosen in order to try to upfront that familiarity with Lumbridge and hopefully become more familiar with it, more comfortable with it, and find that environment more appealing.
Yeah, I think it's probably one of the more starting areas that RuneScape always has had. Like, it would not make sense to start you in the wilderness or like in another place where you have very high level of requirement for the majority of things you can do there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Let me check if there was another one. One of the questions, I forgot to write down the name for this one actually. Why did we change away from unstable foundations? Why did we change that one as well?
Unstable foundations. To be honest, I'm taking this as a series at a time. So I would need to do a bit more research before I could answer that question. But once I've got through this deck, I'm hoping that's going to be my next priority, and I'll see if I can get an answer for that one for you.
Cool. Then we'll keep that one in the drawer. And that was it.
Alrighty. So we move on to the next one. So that's combat. So now that a target for the player has been established, one that's been carefully incapacitated, this goblin, we cover basic combat mechanics. So camera rotation is reiterated because RuneScape's core controls are quite unusual. It's good to keep bringing that up. Moving on. So then Savant establishes some narrative framing for why there's a dragon in his cellar, as well as setting the tone with some of RuneScape's trademark dry humor. That part about something must have roused the dragon, a large noise, tail cramp, the smell of damsels. Nice bit of humor there from Maz. Several concepts are covered here in a succinct amount of writing. It's always best to keep your dialogue short and sweet in tutorials. The more steps the player has to step through, the more inclined they start to just spacebar it and not care anymore, so try to keep it tight. And then Savant powers you up with the familiar sword and shield. Now, interestingly, we don't cover inventory and equipping at this stage. You're automatically upgraded with distinctive training equipment without getting bogged down in teaching panel interfaces. This way we get straight into the fight. We keep the flow and the action. The camera's been nicely positioned here too, so you have to rotate it to see the goblin, and we reinforce the control mechanic. This is a great framing to learn by doing. Because the goblin is incapacitated, there's enough time to take in additional mechanics like the combat level. You also learn you just click once, and you'll continue to perform that action until an outcome is reached. In this case, one of you is going to be dead. Learning a generic core loop concept like that applies to most skills is helpful. There's also a nice rigged event at the end where the goblin retaliates, indicating taking turns in combat, as well as showing how injury is signified in that little box out at the bottom. We got any more questions come up?
Yes, I've got
Yay.
another 4. I'm just copying a regular breakdown, so I've written down 3. This one is from Zarorark, with an extra K at the end as well. He's a student developer and wonders what your thoughts are on fourth wall breaking chat boxes or messages in the game. Does that have an impact as well?
Yeah, sure. So I mentioned that briefly during, I think it was the classic tutorial. So yeah, we've gone kind of across the whole narrative spectrum on this one. Tutorial Island just outright has the characters talk about mechanics very directly, and that has a big advantage in terms of keeping the text succinct. It means we're not having to have a narrative layer that explains that stuff in context, and also information pop-ups that then repeat similar information that actually focus on the mechanics. So that can have some big advantages. But as you say, it also breaks the fourth wall. So yeah, both approaches have their pros and cons. I think in more recent years we've tended to lean more towards trying to maintain that fourth wall and then relying on pop-ups to provide the information mechanically, and then just trying to be really, really careful with the volume of text we're including in either of those media to try and minimize the amount of text you have to read, and then rely a lot more on iconography and interactive engagement to compensate.
And just for the players or the viewers that are watching, would you be able to explain what we generally refer to with the fourth wall as well?
Oh yeah, sure. So that's a cinematic term. Well, actually, I think it may originally come from stage work. Basically, the notion that when you're on the stage, there's the walls on either side of you and the wings and the backdrop behind you, and then the fourth wall is the space between you and the audience. So the notion of breaking the fourth wall is when you someone on the stage is taking themselves out of character. They're speaking directly to the audience. They're acknowledging that they're acknowledging the existence of the audience. You may notice that, for example, in say TV series like The Office, well, they'll often be making eye contact with the audience, with the camera, as a way to kind of share a joke or roll their eyes at the circumstances going on around them. So it can be a useful, particularly a humor device to occasionally break character, but it can also break immersion. So it's something to use carefully.
Thank you for that as well. I just love the example. I never thought about it of that way, that if a character in like a TV movie looks directly into the camera, that it can indeed be, in some cases, definitely fourth wall breaking.
Yeah,
thank you for
exactly.
that comparison, Mods 2. There was another question about, which was more aimed at me, is if we are able to highlight the responses from Maz. If I can get, I think I finally found Maz in the chat. I was trying to figure out who what Maz was, but I think it's Maz Knits. So I'll try and write down what Maz's messages as well, so we can mention them here as well as a way to highlight them.
Yeah, great.
So that's that, and then
Okay.
We can move on again.
Alrighty. So next up we have covering dropped items. So defeating that goblin, he dropped some coins and some bones. We instruct you to pick up those drops. That whole flow is elegantly handled. It's nice and succinct. And again, we reinforce camera control in this tight corridor to be able to continue conversation with Savant. So again, because you're in tight confines, you're having to actually make use of those mechanics rather than just telling you about it. You're having to learn by doing. That's the best way to do it. And then we move on to inventory. So it's only at this point, after the player is comfortable with world interaction and basic controls, that we are introducing the first side interface panel. This isn't the approach we've taken in some of the later tutorials. I really like this approach, and I'm inclined to try and use it in the future. So up until this point, only the options menu has been available, just in case the player wants to adjust their audio volumes or something like that. If I remember correctly, I think that there was also a pop-up with your audio settings that appears just as you have your first conversation with Savant, just to check that the audio settings are good. Maybe you could help me out on this one, Maz. I seem to remember it also we had voice acting. Was it with, I think it was with Unstable Foundations we first did it, when I think we actually tried doing voiceover for the player themselves, and I think that was quite contentious because it kind of gave a particular voice to the character, and some people didn't like that, and that's why we've generally gone with a more of an unvoiced protagonist. Maybe you can confirm that one for me. Wow, I've gone off script.
I've got the answer from Maz already.
Oh, great.
She replies that we definitely didn't do it for this one, but potentially with Unstable Foundations.
Yeah, that would make sense. So we introduced the backpack and its limited number of slots. And your first two items here are very carefully chosen, I assume, to teach the concept of stackable items, currency, and actions within your inventory. And now, personally, I'd be inclined to maybe use this opportunity to bury those bones, and that way we could introduce gaining XP and the skills menu, because otherwise that gets covered quite late on in the tutorial, the notion that you have all these different skills to work with. Then again, and Maz might be correcting me right at this moment, having an action of getting prayer XP on the critical path probably wouldn't be good for prayer pures, but maybe like cutting a gem or something might work. But in terms of this flow, and this is working really nicely so far, the player has the opportunity to organically bury the bones, I assume, but it's actually not telegraphed until a prayer tutorial way near the end of the tutorial, just in case they didn't do it themselves. There's a little extra detail reassuring that certain concepts will be taught later. Some of that's maybe a little bit redundant because it's one more page the player has to click through. I wonder if that might have been intended more to reassure a manager that a certain mechanic was being covered than out of necessity. Any more questions?
Yeah, I've got a couple again.
Great.
I want to jump back to the bit about the Pures, because it was actually just before you started talking about the Pures and in relation to prayer.
Yeah.
There was a question about that as well, which I think was someone who just found it quite frustrating. Tech Grenade says, my question is why we were locked into a tutorial island in the first place. When making Pures, this was really frustrating in the early days. Did we already take Pures, and did we already cater to Pures back in those days?
Well, I mean, it's a case of we had a tutorial island even back in Classic, so I think it's just something that was there from the very beginning, just to try and get people introduced to the mechanics and ease them into the game. In future tutorials, we moved more towards providing ways for you to skip over it, particularly if you're someone who's already familiar with this content. Certainly I did that for the new tutorial island. There's an option in the menu to skip the whole thing, depending on the statement at the start as to how familiar you are with the game. It'll skip tutorial island for you automatically. And there's also the different sections you can jump ahead and just interact with, say, the gate in the survival area, and then skip over those sections. So I've tried to accommodate people who are trying to bypass certain mechanics or are already familiar with the game. But back in the day, I think it was just a case of it was created. It was kind of it was kind of more limited. We didn't really know. I guess those particular subtypes hadn't necessarily taken off at the time. They were kind of evolving even back then. So I guess it wasn't taken into account initially, but it's something we try to be more mindful of nowadays.
Maz adds as well that the tutorial was not there at release. Initially, they were just dumped into the game.
Oh yeah, that's
so
right.
I think
You're
this
right.
is even
Yeah.
before the classics tutorial then that we went through at some point.
Yeah. You're quite right, Maz. Yeah. I mean, classic unfortunately is way back for me. But yes, so initially we wouldn't have had a tutorial. Say just drop straight into Lumbridge. This game's always evolving, always adding more things. I mean, every tutorial we've had has had some degree of refinement to it. Things are always changing and improving. And then there's always more content getting added too as well, which is quite an interesting challenge from a tutorialization perspective.
I mean, this brings up the discussion that we had, I think, 2 streams back about, like, what should you have in the tutorial? Should you talk about all skills, just a couple, or to what extent should you go with the onboarding, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and we've tried various different approaches over the years. That they all kind of have their pros and cons.
Another question from Ninja Damien is there a reason why the backpack has 28 spaces instead of 30? I know we touched on this briefly last time, so I wonder if you still, or if you're able to say again what the reason for that is initially.
Yeah, sure. And again, feel free to correct me, Maz, but my understanding here is that we started with 30 slots in Classic, and then when we changed to a 4x7 grid in the new interface in RS2, we cut it down to 28 slots so it would fit nicely into that grid, and all of our interface panels used those dimensions on those side buttons.
So it's just a thing of real estate on the interface.
Yeah,
I was
there we go.
waiting to find the word for a second. Yes.
Yeah, perfect. You're learning so much.
Cool,
from
let me check
things,
if I had them. I'm getting there. I'm getting there for sure. Another one, which was already asked. Demon Edge asked, given that you could, without any development constraints, what is one thing that you would love to add to a tutorial? Like, just if there's a small thing that you would like to tweak that, for example, might be extremely difficult to do right now.
Thing to add to a tutorial. These questions that put you on the spot. I
mean, you need to make the Q&As a bit difficult, right?
I mean, it's going to be contentious, but honestly, my preference would be to, even though we did Tutorial Island again, there are aspects of that I feel would be strict. I would rather honestly do a 5-minute primer that just covered the absolute basics, and then teach a lot more of that stuff in world in a more context-sensitive fashion. Yeah, I kind of was required to implement that's Tutorial Island reluctantly, and it's always kind of been a bugbear to me. So I guess that would probably be the first one that springs to mind. But yeah, in general, what we do is we track the data for player progression through these. We have information from our analytics team as to where the drop-off points and the churn positions are. So where we identify that players are struggling, and also just from focus testing or from internal feedback, if people are having an issue, if it's a bit of a gnarly point in their progression, then we go in there and we tune it further and we refine it. And then, as I said, also sometimes other mechanics get introduced to the game that can break the tutorials, or that we have to try and adapt for. So it's a constantly evolving process.
Okay. I mean, yeah, I absolutely agree. It's a constantly changing process in that aspect. One more question. This is from a Gryffindor, and I think we already briefly touched on this in the previous stream as well. Could we have an option to replay tutorials, for example, via Hans, the NPC in Lumbridge?
Okay, so first of all, that depends on what you mean by tutorials, of course, because we have a lot of context-sensitive tutorials that are more embedded in world nowadays, rather than necessarily these isolated islands. If you're wanting to, say, be able to replay Learning the Ropes or Unstable Foundations, being able to bring back a particular era of our tutorials, that's quite tricky. A lot of them have kind of fallen into disrepair, as it were, over time. Because as the interfaces get more complex and more features get added, those tutorials aren't going to support those all that well. I mean, that's why, for example, I had to basically make Tutorial Island from scratch rather than being able to really salvage anything from the last one. I referred to the code, but the core systems have just changed so much, having this new interface system and new combat system and so forth. You just have to adapt these things to really be in a state where they're playable. So we could, but it would probably wind up being quite a lot of work for a relatively low gain, because you're going to wind up with something that's quite graphically dated. It's teaching a flow that's was effective at the time, but the game has moved on since then. So I struggle to see much value in it other than nostalgia, to be honest.
Yeah, no, I think you're right on that one. I think it is indeed more of a nostalgia piece.
Yeah, and then also we have done replayable tutorials in the past, like the Ashdale tutorial, for example. It was built that way, and the usage of that feature was very, very low, and it was actually quite resented, given that it had to reset you back into a default state. So, yeah, I have my doubts as to whether there'd be really much player engagement with that for the time it would take, unfortunately.
You beat me to it. I just wanted to bring that up about that we did at some point have a replay feature for one of the
yeah, there we go. Sorry, stole your thunder, Luke.
It's all right. It's all right. No, but about that tutorial as well, it's like if you redid that tutorial, it also changed your interfaces back to the default setting. So a lot of people have their separate preferred setup of their interface, and it had to all be reverted because there were parts of the tutorial that would link to certain elements. And that would automatically change, so there was not a way that you could then avoid it. So if you accidentally started it, which actually some people did, it would actually be kind of an annoyance to them. And I think that also is kind of part of the reason that when we put the current Taro Island back in, that we were like, well, we're not going to add this replay feature again. So yeah, that was just a bit I wanted to add to it, Mods 2.
Cool.
That was it for this section of the Stu and A. I'm just going to try and say the word Stu as many times as possible. But take it away.
Excellent. Great. Okay, so moving on to the quest journal. So as you mentioned before, this was, as far as I know, the first and I think the only, feel free to correct me there, Maz, tutorial that we've ever put into the quest journal. There was a very good reason for that, as far as I can understand, given that it allows you to, actually engage with that system directly, while unlike Tutorial Island, where we kind of have to abstractly tell you about this notion of quests and your quest list, but you wouldn't actually encounter a real quest for quite some time. This is tightly integrated into the tutorial flow. In fact, I believe it's actually implemented rather like a special multi-chapter quest, kind of like a recipe for disaster. At least certainly that's what it looks like from an engagement user flow. Maybe it's something that's more bespoke on the back end. I don't know if you remember that one, Maz. But it also does indicate that there's quite a lot to this tutorial, as you can see on the next page. Yeah. Sorry, 1 second. I need to cough.
Take your time. We're not in a rush. Extremely professional. You even muted yourself. That's
right.
hardcore
don't want to
there.
blow people's heads off. Right. Yeah, so we've got 1 out of these 12 chapters complete so far, and you might have noticed that there's no completion progress bar like on Tutorial Island, so we're effectively using the quest journal as a way of showing that progress. So, moving on. The player chooses a chapter, and we get a detailed breakdown of the steps in that chapter. And we can see this is going to be a very long tutorial, comprehensively detailing RuneScape's mechanics, as you can see in that box out down in the bottom right. Just the information that's going to be covered in this one section alone. So moving on to death. So Savant takes the time to thoroughly explain the death mechanic, the 3-item rule, gravestones, and even random events. I'd say we could probably have afforded to not go into random events. It's probably going to be quite a long while before the player encounters one, but it's really nice to see that level of detail in the death mechanics, because they are quite complex. Although that also does get covered in more detail in a later section.
These
Sorry?
random events, Stu, are these the ones that you would get randomly while skilling to check if you were not a bot?
Yeah, exactly. So it's
Okay,
kind
just
of
checking
making
if
you
there
aware
were
ahead of
those
time
random
that
events.
those are a thing. Yeah.
Glad we no longer have those in game.
Sort of, we do, and to an extent. I mean, the events are removed, but you can like still access the characters that were involved in those events. They've been scattered around various parts of the world, so they still live on in some form. The Frog Prince and Princess and that sort of thing. So the player chooses a chapter, which we've talked about already. Let me just move down. There we go. Okay, so the dragon returns. Now the pacing kicks back up again as the dragon returns. There's a nice sense of progression here as the player faces the dragon alongside Savant, equipped and now trained to engage in combat. Unfortunately, even armed with a sword and shield, the player continues to take their position in Savant's shadow as he battles the dragon. A narrative twist is introduced, however, as a Chaos Druid teleports in, paying off the mystery of the dragon's motivation. This could be a long section, so do you have any questions, Luke?
I didn't really see any in chat with the exception of one. Where is it? It kind of goes back a little bit further as well. Apparently there was been an error or a time where you could only level up to level 3 on Taro Island.
Yeah,
Is
that's
there
right.
a
So
reason
basically,
for that?
yeah, there's a level 3 cap there. I mean, as I understand it, it's basically to discourage you from just spending your life on Tutorial Island. I mean, it may be a comfortable space, but ultimately there's much more efficient ways of playing the game. There's much greater variety of things to do. If you are misled into thinking this is as complex as the game gets, then that may, not keep you playing in the long term. So I think that's why there's that cap there, just to try and give that gentle nudge that move on. There's a lot more to see after this.
Okay. No, I mean, it makes sense. I think there's much more to enjoy than just Taro Island. So yeah.
Yeah, and I believe I do still have the same
Oh.
mechanic that I copied over from the original Tutorial Island in the current one.
Okay.
Yeah, so the Chaos Druid has been established as the antagonist, and we have a stalemate, the eternal conflict of order versus chaos. Quite a crucial element of our backstory there, so it's nice that we've got a kind of an internal metaphor for that going on. This scene establishes a goal for the player also, to get a ranged weapon to take out the Chaos Druid while Savant holds the line. So the pieces are in place here. There's a good justification for why the NPC needs your help, and you set this objective. So nice and tightly managed here. Good work. And checking the quest journal, we can see that we're a little past halfway through the second of 12 chapters. Then the player climbs the ladder, which teaches world interaction in a nice organic way, and then the player's on the surface. As soon as they arrive, they get this bespoke pop-up describing the features of the minimap and the surrounding interface components. Since most of those features don't have hover text, this was a really good way to handle this. And Maz even provided a key on a map on a nearby wall that's retriggerable to be able to get this tutorial back. So good work there. Any questions, Luke?
Of course. This is from Bentoki. And Bentoki asks, how do we find the balance between hand-holding versus letting them just go and explore the world on their own to learn it? How do we find that balance in between that?
That's a very tricky balance to get, and I think we definitely haven't got it right at times. I think over the years we've skewed on either sides of that spectrum towards giving you a lot of agency, and then finding when we did focus tests that people got lost and confused and bored and dropped out, versus having very tightly railroaded and controlled things where you lose that sense of player agency. So it's definitely a tricky balance to get right, and I guess it's something that you just have to kind of refine and tune over time, and get feedback from players and see what the response is like. Because fundamentally, RuneScape is this open world sandbox. It's a game with such an enormous amount of content in it. You have to try to manage what the player interacts with, so that they don't wind up getting down into something that winds up being really frustrated frustrating, and then they give up on the game too early. So you've got to find that sweet spot.
Maz adds as well, this was an attempt to find the middle ground. This what learn the ropes. But I also think like there's not really a golden rule to find define this is how much handholding or how much you should let the player go. I think there isn't really, and maybe it should gradually get less and less and less.
That's certainly something
that so smooth as possible.
Yeah, if you're going to have training wheels, take them off gradually and get them to the place where we'll just be aware of how players are responding to it. You know, if they're feeling that the hand holding is aggravating, then see if we can give more liberty earlier on, as say Maz provided this way that you can do the aspects of the tutorial in a different sequence, for example. That sort of thing helps a lot. So yeah, you just have to refine it over time, which unfortunately means that people are coming through and trying it as you go along.
Yeah, it is just very hard to nail that, and I also just love the analogy of the riding the bike. I can definitely support something like that as a Dutch person.
Yeah, there we go.
Another question. This one is from Skylin. So we already had the question about what you would like to change to the existing tutorials if you ever could. What is the hardest change or the change you've been most proud of that you've already made to the existing tutorials? Because you've worked on a lot of the tutorials and you've been busy with it for a while. What's your favorite thing you've changed?
Well, I'm really glad I've been able to put more of an emphasis on achievement paths as a mechanic for tutorialization. I think that's something that fits better with RuneScape, in my personal opinion, as a way of guiding you around the world but keeping you in the world. And personally, unfortunately, I feel due to some of the feedback I've got, it's leaned a little bit too much towards the railroading again. When I first implemented that system, it was much more freeform in like a response to the previous path system. So again, I think we still need to find that sweet spot, but I'm very pleased with that. And I'm actually quite pleased with how the Berthorpe tutorial has turned out at the moment. There's obviously still things I would like to adjust in it. It is quite combat oriented at the moment. I'd like to try and give the player kind of a broader range of things that they could work with and help to explore the full depth of what RuneScape has to offer. But I think we're heading in the right direction.
I think so, for sure. I mean, you've done a massive amount of work on the existing tutorial on RuneScape, so I think all the things that you have contributed are definitely steps in the right direction. When I joined 2 years ago, I got quite frustrated myself with the tutorial, and a lot has changed since, and all that has changed has been in a positive way.
And that's really helpful to us as well when people internally and externally play the game, can give us that feedback, make us aware of where the sticking points are so that we can address them. Because you can get very close into the project you're working on and not be able to see the wood for the trees. So that external perspective is very, very helpful. And so we really welcome your feedback.
I appreciate it. I'm gonna direct that in a slightly bigger conversation because it always comes to if you recruit people. I think like you said, it's good to have a mix of people that have been playing RuneScape and All and also new people, because like you said, they do just have a different view on the game, and they will indeed point out things that experienced players will no longer point out. And I can tell I've now reached a point that I just know the quirks of RuneScape myself, and that I just don't get angry with it anymore, and I just know what the solution is, even though to a new player that is extremely frustrating. So I thought it's just funny. And also, we've got tons of jobs open at Jagex, so go to careers.jagex.com, I think it is, and take if you want to work for us. I'm just plugging this. I'm just enjoying it today. I just love the tutorials. Join us. Yeah, it's a great company. Join us.
Honestly, I love my job. You get to work from home. I mean, that whole infrastructure is there, so it's very convenient. There's no commuting. I've worked here for nearly 15 years now, and I love my job. So, yeah, by all means, join us.
Yeah, it's definitely a perk right now to be able to work from home. It's not like the majority of other companies are doing that right now.
Yeah, we've been very fortunate.
Cool. I'm going to bring it a little bit back, Stu. and we're going back to tutorials. So we've got the Taro Island, which kind of touches on skills, and we've already briefly touched on like whether we should learn you about a couple of skills or all of them. But what's your thoughts on having a tutorial specifically for bossing?
That's a good point. Now, again, so here's the thing about tutorials. My ideal is that you shouldn't need a tutorial. Ideally, your core mechanics should be elegant and intuitive enough that you don't need to actively explain how it works. So the more investment we can put into actually improving our core experience and simplifying the interfaces and making the interactions more intuitive, the less we have to rely on tutorials as a way to essentially guide the player through those complexities. So where it comes to bossing, because it's a relatively advanced feature, I wouldn't be inclined to tutorialize it in a way that's quite severe and restrictive. But certainly in terms of guiding the player towards appropriate bosses for their level that have gradually introduced them to different mechanics, helping them to engage with a kind of a learner program that other players can help them out with, a way that they can also, because also there's often a social overlap with bossing as well. In terms of group bossing, it's easier if someone else can be there along with you, and so I think that may potentially also fall into more of a kind of a social hub space for tutorialization. Yeah, I think it's certainly something we could do more of. Bossing is kind of a niche, relatively speaking. It's something that you really have to know a lot of the rest of the game in order to really be able to boss effectively. But yeah, I think we could certainly do more work in that space.
The best tutorial is one that you won't notice.
Exactly. If it's transparent, it's like ambient music. You know, if it's something that's improving the experience, but you don't really notice it's there, that's the ideal. If your tutorial is being really obnoxious and in your face, and you're feeling its very existence is frustrating, then that's where you may want to see if we can possibly loosen some of those training wheels.
Yes, understandable.
Yeah, and I've certainly acknowledged our current tutorial does have some of that, which I would like to improve.
Yes. Just before I go to the last question, then we'll move on. Initially, I said it's careers.jagex.com, but it is jagex.com/careers. That should probably bring you there, but I'll also just put the link in chat quickly. So yes, careers.jagex.com would indeed give you an error or whatever. I don't know exactly what it was, but there you go. Apologies for that error on my behalf. The last question before we move on then, what to do. So we talked a little bit about the replay position, and then I mentioned for replayability of tutorials, and then I mentioned that it is actually quite difficult to get that all working with everyone's private UI settings and how they prefer to have just everything on the screen. Saru's Shield Warrior asks about that. Does that mean that we have no way to see where UI elements are placed on the screen, or do we have that? It's just a techie depth question.
Yeah, so actually, there's something that I have mentioned in a previous stream, was that basically this whole client-side dynamic interface that we have gives us very limited awareness from a service perspective as to how your interface is arranged, and that does make things very tricky for us in terms of tutorializing particular parts of your interface, ensuring that you might have a particular panel on the screen, or ensuring that we can highlight the buttons that would help you find it, because a lot of our interfaces are buried quite deep in the parent interfaces and so on. So yeah, it is quite a bugbear. So from a tutorialization perspective, if things were simpler and more agnostic, that would be great. If we weren't having to maintain a new interface system that's all dynamic, and a legacy system, and the mobile interface, but this is the world we're in. So we have to just try and address those challenges.
Yeah. So we can see where all these elements are, but sometimes they might not be displayed on your interface, or similarly, you have put them in such a weird way that it's actually very difficult for us to draw. Like, one of the things that I found out after playing the game for 6 months is you can even drag the game screen itself. So like what is drawn and where the character walks. You can even make that as small or wide or different as you want, which is just weird. Like, I've never seen that in any other game. So I think it's kind of just as a result of the interfaces being so flexible that it's just not reliable to do that.
It's an incredible amount of it's an incredible amount of power and customization that the player has, but that brings with it a lot of complexity, and certainly trying to find a sweet spot of default interface that all players would be happy with is definitely a struggle, particularly as we operate under other constraints like ensuring that it supports a minimum screen resolution, and then on the other end of the spectrum, people have like their high detail, high definition monitors, and people bring their game down and play multiple accounts at once on the same screen, and there's so many different ways that the game gets played, and trying to satisfy all those different cohorts is tricky.
Yes, absolutely. It can definitely be very tricky. Shall we move on again?
Yeah, for sure. So, movement. So now that we're out of that confined area, we cover running. Nowadays, we cover this contextually. So, for example, when the player runs out of run energy, then we might do a context-sensitive pop-up that then makes you aware of the notion of run energy when it's important to you. At the time, run energy also hadn't been rebalanced yet, and it defaults to off. So we covered that as a mechanic, and it's certainly a place where it makes sense to do so, because we've just left a very confined area, and now we're open in this overworld where you have much more traversal to do. So it makes sense to make sure you know about running. And as you can see, there are other players here, but the cellar was instanced. And that provides a sweet spot between a decluttered starting experience and a lonely overworld experience. As I mentioned earlier, this environment it's a non-instanced copy of Lumbridge. And I mentioned that earlier, so I'll move on. So if the player explores their interface here, which I think is the one I'm currently looking at. Yes, we're on the right page. If the player explores the interface here, they'll find that it's still locked down in various ways. We've also only made a tiny proportion of the interface panels available. If you can see those side buttons on the far right, there's still a lot of empty slots. So even though the player appears to be on the overworld, they're actually still very much in the tutorial. In fact, they've barely started. So this could create a feeling of being trapped in the tutorial, maybe some resistance to it. If they're attracted by the notion of exploring this new open environment, they may have no choice but to continue to aid Savant in his quest. You can taste freedom, but it's to some extent denied to you. And this is an area where I feel the Lumbridge Tasks superseded Unstable Foundations. You had that freedom to explore the overworld, but you also have guidance available through those tasks pathing you to certain content. I appreciate I've got a severe bias here, and this was designed by people with very specific aims that Maz kind of had to abide by. So I apologize if this seems like I'm throwing shade. I'm trying to provide a balanced perspective, but I hope this isn't you're taking this too personally. So do you have any questions?
No. I've not seen any questions, so just a reminder, if you've got a question around tutorials, please put them in chat. That's also what we're talking about. I've seen a couple of other questions about other topics, but that's not what we're going to talk about today. Then there was one comment that I'd just like to read out to you, Mod2, because I thought it was very wholesome. Thank you for everything you've done, Mod2. You really are a part of behind-the-scenes pillar holding RuneScape 3 together.
Oh, that's wonderful.
There you go.
Oh, thank you so much. Awesome.
And that is from NBA Baller 003.
Nice.
So
Sweet name too. Okay, so moving on to the range tutor. So now the player reaches the combat training area, which has targets for all 3 styles. Now maybe you can help me out with this one, Maz. I can't recall if this training area was also a permanent feature of Lumbridge at the time. Did it maybe get moved to Varrock? Because I know we have a training area there as well. So let me know about that one, if anyone knows about that.
We'll pay attention. I'll keep an eye out for Mod Maz's response.
Yeah, and as Maz mentions here, all of the tutors, she had a particular name for them, which had in some way connected to their function. So feel free to do a bit of Googling there and try to figure that one out, because even she can't recall what the exact names were. But so Nemity, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, gives the player a training bow and arrows. And we walk the player through equipping items and how they're represented on the avatar in the next slide.
Yes, well, Mazza has already replied, and someone in chat said it as well. But this was in Lumbridge back in the day,
Okay.
and it moved to Verruk much later, or as Maz puts it, way later.
Ah, so it was the same one that moved to Rock. Yes, I got it right. Sweet. Okay, so now we're covering the whole notion of equipping things in detail. And as said, we've not covered that up to this point, even though the player has equipped items. And I really like that approach. It helps us to focus on the notion of inventory at one time, equipment screen at another time, that they aren't overlapping with each other, and you start to get complexities intermixing. So I'm really liking that approach that was taken here. And you're not getting bogged down with certain mechanics, so you can focus on the worn equipment without other distractions. Moving on. Then we move on to items kept on death. So Savant briefly mentioned this earlier, but now we cover it impressively comprehensively, exactly how the death mechanic works. And finally, the equipment stats interface. So we're covering everything on the worn equipment panel. And that way you can see the detailed bonuses applied to you by your equipment.
That screen hasn't changed a single bit.
Well, I mean, where it is has certainly changed, because that's something that's now in the hero parent interface. So it's kind of harder to find to an extent. I mean, there is a kind of a small button that takes you there. So there's a link, as it were. Yeah, I'm kind of in two minds about this interface personally. I don't personally find I need to make much use of it, because nowadays we have the hover tooltips on individual items that make you aware of that. It's not something that I very often need to check how my totals add up, but maybe other people who do more combat find more use for it.
I think it's indeed much more of a niche thing that you prefer to look at if you're like really trying to figure out what your attack bonus and all these kinds of things are specifically.
Yeah, it's a good feature.
Change. Go for it.
I'm just glad that it's like in the parent interface rather than something that's really easily accessible, because I think it's a fairly advanced feature.
I think the only thing that's different with the existing worn interface one is that your hands are now, or your glove slots, or arm slots, or hand slots, weapon slots, I don't know the exact term for these, are actually like one square moved up instead of like dragging along you on the floor. But that's about it, I think.
That's a really good point. Yeah, well, we've had to also squeeze in the pocket slot and the aura slot, and for a while also the sigil slot. So yeah, a bit of rearrangement had to have. And then also as the customization comes in there as well, where it comes to the worn equipment panel, because that's resizable, then we have to adjust those components and essentially have different preset layouts depending on how big that interface is. So yeah, our interface gets quite complicated.
I just had confirmation from some people in chat that apparently it's still touching the floor in that interface.
There we go. Whoops. So then we move on to combat styles, and this is the most comprehensive explanation of combat styles I've seen in a tutorial thus far. And honestly, I really like that it's helping you understand exactly what the benefits are, because back then long range attacks actually increase the range of it. It's not just down to what type of XP experience you're getting from that choice. And what I think is managed really well here is that we cover the mechanics up front, and then in a later section we're going to have you use those mechanics that you learn in situ. So we cover it, and then we reinforce it, and we learn by doing. So really good flow there, Maz. And now that you're thoroughly prepared, you loose an arrow into your target and you're proving that your readiness to assist Savant. And hopefully after all this time he hasn't drag and dropped. So moving on. And this is a good place to take another break because Maz has provided us with another set of fascinating facts. So while you're reading through that, any more questions from the chat?
There was one. I've got a couple of comments as well. There was one question from Mr. Epic Warrior 1, I think it was 2-3 minutes ago, about have we ever considered making a members version of the tutorial of Tutorial Islands for the member skills, really.
Now that's going to be an interesting story when we got into Troll Warzone, because that actually started as you might have seen from the prefix when we did the overview, that was referred to as the opening member game experience, OMGE initially, and then during development it was refactored into being also including all the free-to-play skills and becoming the new tutorial. So yeah, that was something that was considered at one stage, and then it became an entire full-fledged tutorial of Troll Warzone. And from kind of looking at your question on a broader level, though, I can certainly see the value in compartmentalizing the things that we teach, because a lot of our skills are relatively complex member skills. I think having them all in the same space could be kind of overwhelming. And something we moved to with the Birth of Untitled rework was seeing where we could potentially move some of those skills out into other areas that might be more appropriate. Just so that we can stagger that onboarding. Construction, for example, it's fundamentally a money sink skill, so it's not really something that's all that suitable for a completely new player. You need to have some degree of capital early on, and you need to have the resources to be able to build furniture in your house and so forth. So being able to find particular themed spaces for these. So that's, for example, why we also moved things that were more thieving oriented towards Lumbridge, because that's where the Thieves Guild is, and so on.
Cool. Thinking of it, shall we make this use this as a natural endpoint and come back here next time as well, Monster?
Oh yeah, gosh, we're past time. My apologies about that.
Just check in if you're all right with that. Then
yeah, absolutely.
I've got a couple of notes anyway. So if there is a quick question that you want to ask Mods2 about tutorials in particular, or just about Mods2, and then I'll try and figure out whether he's happy to answer that. So please ask nice questions. We'll figure that out. But we'll be gone in a minute. We asked that question. Someone was asking what I was drinking, because apparently it makes me very happy. There's nothing funky going on with my drink. It's just water, I promise. So there we've got that. We can take that one off the list. Some people were asking about evil trees. It is, I believe, currently being looked at.
Oh yeah, I know that Luke's been chasing that one actively. That's been your pet for a while, I believe. I've got to say, by the way, bit of a shout out to Luke here. He is really proactive. I mean, a lot of the issues that I've seen people talking about through social media, and like I see people mention the evil tree in the chat on our last stream, for example. Luke is right on that. He's making sure that these things are being covered. In a lot of cases, it's people are already on those things. Jira's have been created and work's already done. But he makes sure that we get these things sorted out. So he's listening to you guys.
I appreciate that, but you don't have to call me out on that stuff. I'll happily just do it behind the scenes, you know. But I really appreciate that message from you as well, Stu. We've had that one. I saw early on, in particular, quite a few people asking if we could do some JMod love letters. I'll hop into game after this stream, and we'll go to what's your favorite game world, Stu?
Let's go with 84. I believe that used to be the questing world.
Then we'll go to 84, and we'll see you all in.
Oh wait
Lumbridge.
a second. That's also the Combat Academy skilling areas. That might be quite laggy. So yeah, choose somewhere else.
I mean, I've already decided we're going to World 84.
Okay, well there we go.
You committed.
So yeah, so you go do some skilling there as well. There we go.
Yes, and then I'll give a couple of love letters after the stream. Then we'll move on to Twitch Prime. It's coming back again, our favourite thing. I just keep getting more excited about this every time. I find it very funny. 14 days of free membership. Get that with your Twitch Prime. It's a very nice drop. Gets added to the end of your membership, so get it. And like I said before, make sure to use that Twitch Prime sub on one of your favourite content creators as well. Don't use it on us. I think the content creators can do much more with those subs. And then, of course, thank you for being in chat, Maz. It's much appreciated to get that additional developer insight.
Yeah, I hope
which is
that
much
I've
appreciated.
I hope
Go for it.
that I've represented your tutorial fairly. Yeah, please let me know if there's any alterations you'd like to make for the remainder of the script, because we've still got a long way to go on this one.
Mm-hmm. How far are we in now-ish? What's to?
Let's see. I think we're on about slide 34 of about 78. So
85, I'm hearing.
here we go. Thank you.
So we've got a while to go. That's pretty cool. Next week, I'm going to bring some sad news as well. Next week we won't have a tutorial, so I'm sorry. But then we've got some other good news as well, and that is that Mod JD will be back with another pub quiz. So make sure your RuneScape knowledge is up to date. I've been informed he had some good questions again. Everything should be working this time, and if not, then I'll tell him off for that the day after. But I'm 100% sure that everything will be fine. The next tutorial will, of course, be the week after. So if I quickly look at my calendar, that will be the 11th of June. So mark that in your agenda, set your timers, set your Outlook reminders, just set an alarm in your phone, whatever you want, because that's what we're going to continue with these tutorials. That's
Yep.
always
If you enjoyed
fine.
this one, it'll be more of the same. So
Exactly. There's enough to talk about tutorial. There's a lot of people saying we want more tutorial.
awesome.
So that is nice. I mean, after I read the initial message, there was a lot of wholesome comments as well. So have a read of them afterwards as well. I know you always tend to focus on these bits.
Yeah, sure do. Thank you. I love you guys.
I'm just checking with the producer if I said all the things that I had to say. He's not telling me off for not saying anything, so I think we're good. We will be raiding someone in a minute as well, so stick around for a bit, and we're going to have some fun raiding someone. And do you have some closing words you want to say, Motstu?
Just the first thing that springs to mind is thank you so much to Maz for providing additional information on this tutorial. And thank you all for joining me for this wild ride we've been having together. And thank you for your support. And I look forward to seeing you all after that quiz.
There you go. Thank you for these nice words. Look after yourselves, and tot ziens.